Okay, I'll admit it. I've set myself up for a tough pitch. For those of you who've seen the HBO series The Wire, the title of this video might have raised an eyebrow, and that's putting it nicely. In its 5-season run, the show paints a picture of Baltimore in which the institutions that supposedly exist to benefit its citizens have unanimously forsaken this responsibility in order to ensure their own survival. The show follows a group of Baltimore police detectives as they build a case against a criminal enterprise that traffics in heroin. This organization, through violence, intimidation, and the discipline maintenance of an internal command structure, has come to control virtually all heroin trafficking in Baltimore's West Side. At the most basic level, you can watch this show as a story about police detectives, judges, and prosecutors building legal cases to implement wiretaps in the investigation of this organization and others like it. Viewed as a police procedural drama, the show is phenomenal, but this isn't why it's widely considered to be the greatest TV drama ever made. Where the show will really start to dig its tendrils into you is when you start to notice weird similarities between the rigid hierarchies of both the Baltimore Homicide Division and the Barksdale organization. Both organizations ultimately have bottom lines, which brings codes of conduct, performance evaluations, and bosses that the members of both groups need to satisfy in order to thrive and in some cases to survive. In both organizations, you'll find people stuck in this weird position of needing the organizations for the financial, emotional, and existential comfort that they provide, and at the same time feeling that the needs of the organization conflict with their inner values. In the police department, in the schools, in the print media, and in what remains of Baltimore's shipping industry, people seem to constantly have this carrot of hope dangled in front of them. They're told that they'll soon be able to get back to doing the work that justifies their existence, but first they just need to win an election, or get some funds appropriated, or get their readership up, or get their truancy numbers below the state funding threshold. To hit that target, they need to play a numbers game, but once that target is hit, they're assured they'll be able to do real, meaningful work. But in every case, the target seems to pull back forever, leaving these organizations playing perpetual numbers games that the longer they're played, the less anyone seems to know or frankly care what the numbers represent. The Baltimore that we see in The Wire is a city in which the only people who seem to prosper are in on some racket, a city whose citizens almost universally consider the good days as having passed, leaving only decay and decline ahead of them. It shows how institutional conflicts of interest have created a perfectly self-sustaining ecosystem of despair, and it shows the vultures who feast on and propagate this system. And it doesn't do this from an ivory tower, it gets down in the alleys and the corners and shows you people in the greatest depths of human misery, people who feel that the only thing that they have left to hope for is a temporary high. It shows that large organizations frequently render good intentions moot, and it shows that having a moral compass in these organizations is more often a liability than an asset. And yet, despite all of that, I'm sticking to my claim. I hope to explain in this video why a show about cold-blooded murderers, human traffickers, and system-milking politicians is not only an optimistic show, it's the work of fiction that's had by far the greatest positive impact in my life. But what does it mean to call a work of fiction optimistic? One of the challenging things about crafting a definition here is that I think the definition changes over time. Most human problems used to be oppositional in nature. As recently as our grandparents' generation, human existence was a scramble to stay on top of and defeat some opponent. We have to stay ahead of the Soviet Union. We have to stop the Nazis. We have to defeat the Redcoats. The Mongolians are coming and we need to build a wall. The Assyrians are coming, so frankly, we just gotta get the fuck out of here, like right now. But I'm willing to bet that you've lived most, if not all of your life in the period since the collapse of the Soviet Union. You haven't grown up with the feeling that a group of bad guys is raising an army to come invade your shores. The challenge for our generation is that any time someone seems like an inspirational figure, we can start a timer in our heads until they try to rope us into a crypto pump and dump.
Fatty for life.
For our generation, the challenge is not reminding ourselves that we're the good guys, it's maintaining a sense of purpose and resolve in a world full of people who tell us that they want to help us, but who always seem to be playing some game behind the scenes. Our problems aren't characterized by a group of bad guys that we need to join hands to defeat. They're characterized by factors that alienate and isolate us, that make us feel that we can't and maybe shouldn't trust anyone. Here's another way that I think the definition of optimistic has to shift over time. Our generation had access to modern information technology during our formative years. The traditional lesson structure for children entering the school system was something like alphabet, phonics, spelling, vocabulary, then grammar, and so on and so forth. But for us, it was more like alphabet, phonics, the CIA ran secret experiments in the 50s to give LSD to prisoners. More traditionally optimistic stories are now difficult for modern audiences to resonate with because they just seem dishonest on some level. Contrast The Wire with a more traditionally optimistic story, Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol is a great example of a feel-good story. The crotchety old Ebenezer Scrooge goes through his life cracking the whip on his workers and pinching every penny out of them that he can, with no regard for the impact that this has on other people. But through a series of visions, he's shown the error of his ways. He comes to understand that he can have either a positive or a negative impact in people's lives, and he realizes that no amount of wealth is worth the suffering that he's caused. If you were to show this to children today, their reaction is very likely to be, "Word? That's your message?" You know what, dude, you're right. I think Bernie Madoff just needed a hug. That's a good point. In the period when our cultural battle was one of reminding ourselves that we're the good guys, these kinds of stories probably did have widespread resonance. But for those of us who you might call the post-Cosbyans, there just seems to be this fundamental dishonesty in stories like this. We're a hard audience to sell these stories to, okay? We know that Shamu isn't doing backflips because he likes doing them. He's doing them because they take his food away if he doesn't do them. And when he gets too old to do flips, they throw him into a meat grinder and turn him into male vitality pills or some shit like that. I don't have a comprehensive theory of how fiction works in the human mind or what its ultimate value is, but I think I can take a stab at saying what it definitely isn't. You don't watch Jurassic Park and say, "You know, I really teetered on this issue, but I'm now fairly convinced that we shouldn't clone dinosaurs." No, you watch that movie and you get sucked into the setting, the action, and the characters' journeys, and you think that you just saw a kick-ass summer blockbuster with memorable lines. But some part of that experience just sticks with you, and then 20 years later, you're watching Tiger King, and this voice just stirs up inside of you that says, "You know, I've got this weird feeling this isn't gonna work out very well." The most valuable works of fiction lie dormant inside of us until we need to make a difficult decision. They return to us and give us a weird kind of confidence, because on some level we feel like we've already considered the ground that we're treading. An optimistic work of fiction is not one that tells you that everything isn't as bad as you think, or that assures you that everything is going to turn out fine. They don't exist to dull our pain, they exist to help us decide what to do with it. They remind us that no matter how bleak and oppressive the obstacles in our lives seem, that there is still some element of the human spirit that external circumstances are powerless to diminish. And maybe counterintuitively, the things that at a surface level make these stories less feel-good can actually make them more optimistic. If Rocky had won his boxing match against Apollo Creed, that movie would have been more of a feel-good movie. You see, all it takes is determination and hard work. Nobody believed in him, but he believed in himself. And if you believe in yourself, then you can do whatever you want to do. The problem is that in our actual day-to-day lives, we don't have too many experiences that tell us that if we start jogging for a few months, we'll suddenly be able to defeat the world's greatest professional boxer. The real power of that movie is in the fact that Rocky is celebrating before the decision is even read. You see, our lives are full of instances where we have to decide whether we choose to value ourselves based on an external criteria like winning a title, or based on an internal criteria that we alone control. Rocky defines success as controlling what he could control, of never giving up as long as his legs could lift him back up, and because he succeeded by his own criteria, it's meaningless to him what anyone else thinks of his performance. A less feel-good outcome actually makes this movie more optimistic. Recent life experiences made me realize that I had taken a lot more away from The Wire than I had consciously recognized when I first watched it. Before rewatching The Wire to make this video, I'd seen the series from start to finish twice, once before starting college and once during college. I think I took from the show what most popular discussion of it would lead you to expect. It's a show about institutional rot, bureaucratic inertia, and the ways that complex organizations seem to always crush idealism. It's all very intellectual stuff, and if I'm honest, a big part of the reason that I watched the show when I was younger was to be part of the conversation, to seem like a man of culture. All of the suave, intellectual culture shapers seemed to be convinced that it was the greatest show ever made, and if I'm honest, a big part of the reason that I watched it stemmed from my wanting to cast my lot with those people.
At the front end, I got to tell you, I'm a huge fan of The Wire. I think it's one of the greatest, not just television shows, but pieces of art in the last couple of decades. I was a huge fan of it.
If you had asked me 5 years ago what I think the greatest TV drama of all time was, I would have said The Wire because of its nuance and cultural relevance. And it's so real, you know, the character actor who played Bubbles was approached with heroin to buy. It's a documentary, it's not a show, and, you know, blah blah blah. If you asked me the same question today, I would give you the same answer, but my reasons have completely shifted. About a year ago, I was in the scariest place that I had ever been in my life. I worked in a large organization that ostensibly had a mission. The product of its operation was supposed to make the world a better place, and if you read all of the PR material on its website, you'd be assured that that was the sole reason that it existed. But the longer that I worked in this job, it became harder and harder to tell myself that this was true. You see, the organization had a bottom line. It needed to maintain an income in order to perform its mission, and almost without exception, I saw the higher-ups lose sight of an important distinction. The money is supposed to support the mission. The money is not the mission itself. Over time, I witnessed these absurd instances of the incentives of the organization causing it to act in ways that outright betrayed its stated goal. I'm not going to talk about my past in any great detail, but I will say that I've never worked as a homicide detective. I think that people from a broad range of professions will relate to my experience, though. If you've worked as an educator, you may have seen your organization prioritize standardized test scores over everything else, even if doing so seems to be at the cost of benefiting the kids. If you've worked as a surgeon, you might have encountered cases where a patient could outright avoid the need for a surgery with some basic lifestyle changes, but found that this conflicts with the organization's desire to book as many surgeries as possible. And if you've worked as a journalist, you might have encountered an especially brutal form of this contradiction. A journalist has supposedly entered the career on the basis that they're interested in uncovering the truth. The real value of a journalist is in their ability to look behind a facade and to see the man behind the curtain, and their ability to cut through mythology and PR and to show the world as it actually is. The thing about the truth is that it isn't like a gold coin that can be debased while still being 80% gold. Things either are or are not true. And when a newspaper considers running a story with fishy, unverifiable sources on the basis that it might increase readership, there's a special kind of compromise happening. This is a compromise that invalidates the sole reason that the organization has to exist. Imagine someone who's just been hired as the editor of a newspaper. They might be 15 years into their career at this point. Journalism isn't just a job to this person, it's what they live and breathe. It's the only skill set that they've developed because they have no desire to do any other type of work. Imagine that this person is also still carrying heavy debt from their education because until this promotion they'd been working for a fairly minimal salary. This is a person who deeply needs their job, both for the fulfillment that it provides and because of the debt that they took in order to get the position. And the brutal reality is that that makes this person very easy to pressure. This editor is now high enough in the food chain that their work now directly presses against the bottom line of the higher-ups. Before, they were only responsible for their own work, and they held their work to a high standard. But now they're in a supervisory position, and they're finding that when they hold the same standards, that it not only doesn't increase their standing with the higher-ups, it more often actually diminishes their standing. It becomes very clear that what the bosses want is eyeballs, that the stories that they want to write and publish are the ones that will grab attention. And it becomes increasingly clear that they're willing to compromise the core values of journalism to achieve this. When the editor decides to pull a story because they've all but confirmed that a source was fabricated, they aren't praised, they're reprimanded. Why are you trying to sabotage this story? It's an important story about an important topic, and furthermore, it's unbecoming of you to be a barrier to these young journalists. You need to encourage them, not to berate them. The editor begins to realize that the paper doesn't really reward commitment to principle. In fact, at times it outright punishes it. And on the flip side, the slimy ladder climbers of the organizations who will cut corners to write whatever stories the bosses want, well, they're on meteoric career trajectories. These ladder climbers are likely to achieve more fame and recognition in 5 years on the job than this editor has achieved in 15 years, despite lacking any kind of talent or principle. But the ego bruising that this undoubtedly leads to is far from the worst thing about being in this position. The most hellish part of being in a situation like this is navigating an inner tension, loving and more importantly needing a job, and yet feeling that in order to keep that job, you'll have to compromise the very values that brought you to it. If you've been in a situation like this before, you know how frightening it can be, and the scary part of it has nothing to do with the bosses or the organization. The scary part is that as you start to game through how you'll keep the job and how you'll make strategic compromises for the sake of pleasing the bosses, something inside of you just feels like it's warping. You feel this inner judge just staring at you, studying you, and that inner judge starts to entertain the idea that your values must not have been that important to you in the first place. The Wire sat completely dormant within me for a decade until I had an experience very similar to this one. I spent 12 years building a resume within my profession, only to find that the qualities that are supposed to draw you to that profession were only going to be a liability to me going forward. I completely lost the ability to tell myself that I was doing the job because the work was meaningful. I became painfully, torturously aware of a bleak reality. It was the financial burden of my student loans and my fear of losing the identity that I'd formed in the job that was keeping me working there. Furthermore, I was compromising my core values in order to stay in good standing. I started to see myself as more of an animal than a person, and I started to wonder if I ever really held any values. And during my panicked, sleepless nights, for some weird reason, a show about homicide detectives and street gangs started flashing into my mind. It's my hope in this video to help shed light on what The Wire really shows behind its more obvious messages about institutional conflicts of interest. But in order to talk about what I think are the deeper messages of the show, it's worth establishing a bird's eye view of the elements of the show that are more traditionally recognized as its greatest feature, its detailed breakdown of the tragedy that is Baltimore, a once prosperous city that's now in a state of physical and spiritual decline. Baltimore very rapidly rose to prominence as a shipping city in the late 1700s due to its proximity to productive wheat farming regions and its unique topographical feature of being right on the edge of a plateau. This creates steadily flowing streams, which are the ideal conditions for flour mills. Baltimore became a shipping hub in this period because at that time there was massive foreign demand for American flour, in no small part due to the Napoleonic Wars, which destroyed much of Europe's productive farmland. If you want the TLDR of why Baltimore declined as a shipping city in relative terms, it's trains and shit.
That is the sound of inevitability.
Technological advancements really undercut the value of the city's unique geographical positioning, and modern advancements in shipping have completely changed what makes a port desirable. Nowadays, shipping isn't done on ships that look like this, it's done on ships that look like this, and compared to Baltimore, New York just blows it out of the water in terms of how it handles ships of this type. Baltimore had always had a significant population of freed black dock workers. This was due to Maryland's unique positioning as being a northern state bordering the southern states. Two massive migrations of black dock workers hit Baltimore in the 20th century, the first being due to the brutality of Southern Jim Crow laws, and the second being due to the sudden and massive increase in demand for shipbuilders during the Second World War. Prior to this, many of Baltimore's black neighborhoods had been victim to predatory mortgages that concealed from the occupants the fact that no equity was being gained through house payments. This meant that as demand for housing in black neighborhoods skyrocketed during these migrations, the landlords were just able to raise rents. This resulted in single-family homes of Baltimore's black neighborhoods commonly being occupied by 3 or 4 families. After the end of the Second World War, these neighborhoods found themselves in a deeply unfortunate situation. Now that the massive surge in demand for dock workers was over, the only employment opportunities left for black workers were low-wage service industry jobs and municipal roles in areas like sanitation and public transit. Most of the houses that they'd occupied were at this point in a state of total disrepair due to having been overcrowded for decades, and on top of that, the city needed space for urban revitalization efforts. The GI Bill had promised all soldiers of the Second World War assistance in getting established in new homes, but in practice, Maryland's execution of this bill denied this benefit to black soldiers. In the years following World War II, many of these black neighborhoods were seized by eminent domain and demolished to make room for single-family houses, commercial development, and infrastructure projects such as the interstate system. In order to free up space, large public housing projects were built, the idea being to contain poverty vertically so that more space was free for the type of development that would ultimately expand the city's tax base. All of this just sets the scene for the disastrous impact of the war on crime and later the war on drugs. In 1968, Lyndon Johnson signed the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act, which set aside $400 million in federal funds to assist police departments in policing their inner cities. Because Richard Nixon had campaigned in 1968 on being tough on crime, he had to one-up Johnson, and he bragged during his 1972 campaign that his administration had awarded $1.5 billion in law enforcement grants. This established a trend. In order to not be seen as some sandal-wearing commie, you have to throw billions of federal dollars at inner-city crime prevention. The problem that this causes is that these programs require oversight. Unless you're the Pentagon, you can't just make billions of dollars disappear. You need to be able to say who you gave the funds to and why. A simple way to do this is to define a department's need for funding as being synonymous with their arrest rate. The 2005 Justice Assistance Grant reportedly asked its recipients to report their arrest statistics and gave no consideration whatsoever to the rate of violent crime. The war on crime created a tragic numbers game that removed the incentive to do real police work. If a steady stream of criminals guarantees that you'll continue to receive funding, then what incentive do you really have to take measures to reduce crime, especially if that crime is heavily concentrated in areas that you'd written off as economically non-viable? The war on drugs is the last and the most critical piece of the puzzle. By adding drug arrests and seizures to the list of things that can ensure a police department receives funding, it created the conditions under which countless non-violent drug users, many of whom were heads of household, became defined as criminals. Many of them ended up in prison serving long sentences, leaving their children seeking something to at least partially fill the void of family life. Let's say you were an amoral person looking for an economic opportunity in these conditions. Well, the elimination of local small-time drug dealers didn't remove the demand for drugs, it just reduced the supply, which means the price that can now be charged for those same drugs is higher. There's also a lot of fatherless children and teenagers in Baltimore's black neighborhoods as a result of this policy, so why not offer them a kind of group membership? Get these lost youths to agree to sell your drugs. They likely don't see much of an alternative future ahead of them, and they crave structure and belonging, so they're likely to be easy to persuade to this end. Because you're doing this at scale, you start to make serious money, and that signals to others that there's money to be made in this venture, which means that you soon have competition in the form of other drug gangs. But because you're operating outside of the law, violence is your only recourse if these people start encroaching on your territory. But to the police, this is just the best news that they could have been given. You mean that there's now more number padding to be done both from the drug trafficking and the arrests for violent crime? And this entire thing just becomes a self-licking ice cream cone. The increase in violence and the higher volume of drugs in the streets means that families are disrupted at an even greater rate as more young men are killed or arrested, which just increases the recruitment base of gangs. And as a cherry on top, the police don't have a real incentive to come after the higher-ups of your organization. They make their stats on small-time busts. They don't have a real reason to do slow, serious police work of the type that threatens your safety, since they can make dozens of small-time seizures in the same time. Your only real threat becomes rival gangs and people giving up information about the structure of your operation. Witnesses to your crimes become loose ends that have to be tied up, and members of your gang that show signs of weakness and therefore willingness to snitch have to be dealt with. But if you manage these risks, you basically get to ride this gravy train forever. A gravy train so bountiful that members of the government might even agree to help you maintain it as long as they get to take their cut. This gravy train will roll on forever as long as everyone gets their numbers. The drug organizations make their money, the police get their enforcement grants, and corrupt lawyers and politicians get their checks for either helping criminal organizations to minimize legal risk or for helping them to launder their money through legitimate revenue streams. As long as the bodies keep piling up, as long as the drugs keep filling the streets, and as long as the police and the legal system are content to play these futile games of whack-a-mole, everyone gets to take their cut of the money. Everyone except for the cannon fodder, the pawns who make the whole operation work.
Pawns, man, in the game, they get capped quick. They be out the game early.
Unless they some smart-ass pawns.
This brutal numbers game is exactly what The Wire drops you into. Baltimore as it exists in the years following 9/11, a time when counterterrorism was the new sexy thing pulling all of the federal grants, and the interest in serious investigations of drug organizations was understandably low. It starts by following a group of detectives who are trying to nudge the police department towards committing resources to a slow, methodical investigation of a drug organization run by Avon Barksdale, the heroin kingpin of West Baltimore. The show chronicles the institutional roadblocks that they face along the way, but beyond that, it presents us with a reality in which it isn't just the police department that crushes the good intentions of its members. Everywhere that the show takes you, idealism is consistently crushed by organizational incentive structures to the point that the viewer will start to doubt if any positive changes can possibly come from these organizations. It shows that the despair and hopelessness of the remaining longshoremen has created a perfect niche for charlatans to dangle hope in front of them, to promise them that Baltimore will once again be the city that their grandparents knew. They just need a little bit more money to make it happen. It shows that the city now in a fundamental sense belongs to these charlatans, that the only real remaining industries are selling one form of pain relief or another. Either empty promises about the bright future ahead, or actual drugs that just dull the pain of this purposeless existence. It shows the victims of all of this in the pits of despair, most notably through the character of Reginald Cousins, who's more widely known as Bubbles. Over the course of the series, Bubbles struggles with the knowledge that his heroin addiction is preventing him from seeking deeper fulfillment in life, and yet he sees no escape from his misery that looks plausible enough to turn down the immediate here and now bliss that drugs bring him. The Wire shows many people in a similar predicament, people who are certain that their best days are behind them and that fleeting short-term pleasures are the only satisfaction in life worth pursuing. It shows how children are so hardened by the way that this system victimizes them that they become trapped in it, unable to see any attempt to help them as anything other than a lie meant to make them vulnerable. And maybe the most tragically of all, it shows that in a lot of cases they aren't wrong for feeling this way. This is a good point to pause the video and say to yourself, surely the title here is some kind of troll operation. But I believe that this show is ultimately an optimistic one with every fiber of my being. I had no idea that this was the case when I first watched it. It wasn't until it became a source of comfort to me in the most difficult period of my life that I really started to question what I had actually taken from the show. The way that The Wire first started to come back to me during this period of my life was through the character of Jimmy McNulty. Played by the top-billed actor of the series, McNulty is clearly the character that most viewers would identify as the main character, especially in the first season. When I was younger, I saw Jimmy as this punk rock character. The Wire is full of these institutionalist pigs whose interest in police work stops and ends at whether it will get them a promotion and a pay raise, but Jimmy would stick it to these squares. He kept it real. Jimmy is natural police. He's in the job because he takes deep satisfaction from solving cases. He's disgusted by the numbers games that plague the department, and he sees them as a distraction from making meaningful cases against the real power players behind Baltimore's drug trade.
We put some years over top of some of these low-level people, we'll roll a few, no problem.
You're not gonna get Avon Barksdale, or Stringer Bell, or anyone else above the street, not on street rips.
He's not interested in the bodies, he's interested in figuring out who's producing them and finding out who they are and how they operate. He's good at every element of the job. He's good at interviewing suspects, he's good at investigating crime scenes, he knows how to recruit confidential informants, he has a knack for surveillance, and he knows Baltimore's drug culture inside and out. In fact, Jimmy's the character who makes the initial recognition of the fact that the Barksdale organization even exists, a reality that bewilders the other detectives in his unit who've never even heard of Avon Barksdale.
Give me a break, Jimmy. 2 days ago, no one on this fucking floor knew this mope's name. Now he's some kind of criminal mastermind.
Shit, I say we go down to the terrace and fuck some people up.
He sees right through the bullshit of the police department. He knows the precise political mechanisms that are blocking him from doing good police work, and he's committed to sidestepping them at any cost. And this is ultimately why McNulty is so admired and respected within the police department.
This guy and his fucking problems are standing between me and all worldly pleasure.
Clearly.
Yeah, that's not the case. That's not the case at all. Jimmy's dedication to the job is a constant source of conflict with his bosses. In fact, he's started to pick up on subtle hints that he isn't exactly what they see as promotion material.
These are for you, McNulty.
Before creating The Wire, David Simon was an investigative journalist, and he spent an entire year embedded within the homicide unit of the Baltimore Police Department. This led to the creation of the book Homicide: A Year in the Killing Streets, chronicling his time with the unit. This experience was critical in writing The Wire. Some of the characters in the show are named after, based on, or even played by people that he met in his year with the unit. Simon paints a pretty compelling picture of the Baltimore Homicide Unit as being a unit that requires its members to read the room. The sergeants that homicide detectives work under live or die by their murder clearance rates, so long-term investigations represent a diversion of resources that directly conflicts with the interests of the higher-ups. Additionally, Homicide as a unit was frequently tasked with handling politically sensitive cases that would have the mayor or commissioner promising hellfire and vengeance if a particular case wasn't put down and put down fast. This is not the type of environment in which it would behoove you to fuck around taking requests for resources outside the chain of command when your bosses want to shut down an investigation. You know, unless you really like the smell of diesel fumes. While the police department seems to do everything it can to sideline people like McNulty, it seems to be obsessed with rewarding ass-kissing loyalty even if the rewards fall on grossly incompetent, corrupt assholes. The department regularly looks the other way on serious transgressions from some of its members, transgressions that have the potential to harm ongoing investigations and embroil the department in scandal. They overlook these transgressions because at the end of the day, they don't threaten the overall structure. These things can be massaged and minimized, especially if the transgressions were committed against people with criminal records, because who would take their word over the word of one of Baltimore's finest? The higher-ups are willing to tolerate these transgressions because they ultimately know what prompted them, a desire for more money and status within the organization. This makes these people safe, predictable, it makes them known quantities, and large organizations tend to really like known quantities. A character that juxtaposes very well against Jimmy McNulty is Detective Thomas Hawk, more widely known as Hurc. Hurc is unable to see his role as a detective through any lens aside from his own rank. He is solely concerned with who is allowed to give him orders and who he can give orders to.
Notice that most of the time it's like he would think she's above us or something. I mean, I don't see any stripes on the fucking sleeve.
His entire reason for being in the police department is that he wants to climb its ranks, to get his stripes so that everyone will know what a big, powerful man he is. He lacks any qualities that would set someone up to do good police work, and yet, over the course of the series, Hurc fails upwards. None of his bad qualities seem to hold him back, and it becomes clear that his bad qualities are exactly what make him so predictable and non-threatening to the higher-ups. Hurc knows who the bosses are, and at every stage of his career he shows a keen desire to please the people above him to maximize his own upward mobility. If what he wants is bits of ribbon to go on his uniform, the bosses are content that they can just keep pulling them out of their ribbon drawer to keep him happy and compliant. Hurc doesn't threaten the structure, he makes it very clear that he'll do whatever it takes to make the higher-ups happy. And even if Hurc wanted to cause problems for the department, he's frankly too stupid to likely be able to figure out how to do this.
Hey, yo. Huh? Let me ask you a question. Where do you guys get those hats with the bills over the ears like that? I go into all the city stores, and the only ones I could find are the ones with the bills in the front.
Nah, it's the same. Just turn it sideways on your head.
Thanks. Thank you.
Contrast this with Jimmy. Jimmy doesn't seem to be particularly concerned with money, and he's perfectly comfortable with being regarded as the scum of the earth within the department. This makes Jimmy a threat. He might do crazy shit, like ruin the numbers game by forcing the department to pull resources away from its buy-bust model. Far worse, he might start asking the kinds of questions that will get the higher-ups nervous, questions related to how the Barksdale organization launders its money, which will start to cause problems for the people who sign their paychecks. I find so much about Jimmy to be uncomfortably relatable. Yeah, I mean, that's relatable, right, fellas? I mean, we all been there. What I mean is I relate to his anger, to his sense that it just isn't fair that this system rewards brown-nosing and institutional loyalty over talent and good work. More than that, I relate to his coping mechanism. I can't relate to being a virile police detective stud who women are powerless to resist, but I can relate to Jimmy's reliance on heavy drinking as a coping mechanism. Jimmy is far from the only character in the show who seems to struggle with this anger, at this sense that the system is inherently corrupt and that you have to be crooked to get ahead in it. The Wire shows people idealistically fighting these systems with typically predictable results. But it shows you more people who've quietly resigned themselves to the reality of their situation, people who've just accepted they have too much at risk in trying to fight their organizations and who've resolved to just trying to make the best of things. But across the board, all of them are crushed by numbers games. In the Longshoremen's Union, membership and revenue are declining, so illegitimate revenue sources and political favors are needed as a remedy. In City Hall, crime is a hot-button issue in the upcoming election, so murders need to be kept below 275 for the current year by whatever means. Wink wink, nudge nudge, please massage the stats. In the school system, funding declines with increased truancy, so efforts are made to get students into school for 2 days out of the month so that they technically aren't truant on paper. And tragically, while playing these numbers games, opportunities to make real lasting change just slip by. A perfect example of this can be found in the character of Frank Sobotka, the president of the Longshoremen Union featured prominently in the second season. His life is practically defined by addressing the gap between the revenue that Baltimore's shipping industry provides and what he needs in order to keep the longshoremen union together. He finds clever ways to slip his workers money under the table when they start to consider leaving the union, but he knows that this is just a temporary band-aid on a gaping wound. He desperately needs to find another source of revenue, and he knows that in the shipping industry, the easiest way to do this is to allow morally unscrupulous people to use his shipping containers to move illicit products. Frank turns to this strategy out of pure desperation, but he discovers that the people using his containers to smuggle goods are up to some serious shit. They aren't pinching a few flat screens, they're into human trafficking and who knows what the fuck else. But the problem is that he needs this money in order to keep his union together and to pay politicians to redirect funds to dock revitalization so that he can eventually abandon this practice. The utopia that he's chasing is the return of Baltimore as a bustling shipping hub when his job will give him everything that he needs: his security, his fulfillment, and his sense of belonging and community. Frank feels that this long-term reward is enough justification to play this numbers game in what he hopes is the short term, but at the same time he carries this incredible guilt and conflict inside of him. And beyond that, this single-minded pursuit of a perfect future blinds him to what's going on around him that he can change. His son Ziggy, for absence of any feeling that his father's profession has a future for him, and for lack of a present father figure, goes about trying to find a new identity and a sense of worth in an industry that he does see as having a future: narcotics trafficking. Ziggy doesn't even really seem to want the money, he wants the sense of recognition, he wants to be somebody, he wants what the more senior members of the Longshoremen Union have. They've been initiated into a kind of fraternity, they have a place in the folklore and the mythology of this organization. But unlike his father, Ziggy knows on some level that there's just no future for him in this profession. Frank Sobotka, while he's focused on winning a game that sheer economics renders futile in the long term, loses the trees for the forest. It creates a feedback loop. The more he defines this thing as his mission in life, the more he needs the payoff of the return to paradise, because he's compromised so much that he's alienated himself from his family. He's now what poker players would call pot committed. He's gone all in, and now he needs to hit his flush on the last card. Jimmy McNulty has a similar feedback loop. He needs to do the job the way that he thinks it should be done in order to find the work fulfilling, but part of him knows that this is only going to bring him pain and misery in his career. The problem is that he's made this job his entire reason for being, to the point that he has a strained relationship with his ex-wife, which leaves him liable for massive child support and alimony and only increases his need for a paycheck. It puts him in these situations where the bosses are pressuring him to do the work in a way that conflicts with his values, and he just has to swallow his pride. This kills him inside, and it creates a feedback loop. He drinks to kill the misery, which puts him into an even worse financial position, which leaves him even more vulnerable to being manipulated by his bosses.
I am fucked. Fucked is me.
The only pleasure that he gets in life is the fleeting short-term pleasure of working a real meaningful case, but his approach to these cases gets him into shit with the higher-ups constantly. The only relief that he gets from the pain that this causes him is Jameson. Specifically Jameson. Jimmy is at least faithful in that one aspect of his life.
I get a Jameson.
Bushmill's okay.
That's Protestant whiskey.
The price is right, ain't it?
Every positive in Jimmy's life is something instant and immediate, which makes him deprioritize long-term benefits like improving his relationship with his family. Okay, rule 1 of marital disputes is don't use your weekend custody to have your kids tail criminal suspects. For fuck's sake, Jimmy, give your attorney something to work with. He's trapped in this awful, vicious cycle. His job and his Jameson are all that he has, and yet they don't love him back the way that he loves them. And what's so sticky about situations like the one that Jimmy finds himself in is that a lot of his anger is actually well placed. I'll go a step further. Jimmy is flat out right about a lot of the causes of his problems. His plastered bar rants have some real wisdom in them. This police department doesn't reward competency, it rewards ass-kissing chain of command loyalty. He's right about that. The bosses intentionally kill serious investigations by underfunding and understaffing them so that they can get back to playing their numbers games. This is verifiably true. The bosses themselves are politically motivated hacks who are where they are because of an animal survivalship instinct, not because of talent or commitment. Jesus, if anything, I think Jimmy is underselling that point. And more than anything, he has this sense that if everyone in the department was like him, he wouldn't have any problems, that he'd be able to do actual police work and be promoted rather than harassed for his approach. This anger expresses itself very clearly in the first season when Jimmy and State's Attorney Rhonda Perlman meet with Maurice Levy, the defense attorney of a suspect in the shooting of Detective Kima Griggs. Jimmy knows that Levy's client was at least involved in the shooting, and he attempts to negotiate for a confession. But through legalese and exploitation of loopholes, Levy helps his client, who he also knows is guilty, to avoid criminal complacency, offering a plea to a far less serious offense as a substitution. After this meeting, Jimmy explodes at Rhonda, telling her that if everyone in her profession weren't so goddamn career-minded, the system would weed these people out and real police work would be possible.
If half of you had the fucking balls to follow through, you know what would happen? A guy like that would be indicted, tried, and convicted. And the rest of them would back up enough so we could push a clean case or two through your courthouse. But no, everybody stays friends, everybody gets paid, and everybody's got a fucking future.
When I said that I relate to McNulty before, this was the thing that I meant. This anger at the world for depriving me of an opportunity to do good work, to do the thing that I was good at, that I had sacrificed and structured my life around being able to do. The system that I had hoped would allow me to find meaning in life seemed to be totally dominated by careerists who seemed completely content to play numbers games that contradicted the stated goals of the organization. It sent me into this spiral of spending all of my nights in a drunken stupor trying to figure out who was to blame. When you're in a situation like this and you don't see a way out, the catharsis of being able to tell yourself who done it is so powerful. It's like a drug. You can put a face to your problems and say, it's that shithead there who did this to me. A natural tendency when watching The Wire is to look for the big bad, the asshole under the Scooby-Doo mask who is behind everything the whole time, that guy who's just different from everyone else in some easily identifiable way. But the problem that I run into in my search for the big bad is that everywhere I look in The Wire, I see people who almost fit my mental caricature of them, but who just slightly don't in a way that's frankly infuriating. Hurc is a brutal bastard who seems to lack any empathy or positive qualities for most of the show, but he also has these moments where he appears to genuinely feel empathy from others. Tommy Carcetti, the ambitious city council member with eyes for the mayor's seat, makes all of these cynically calculated maneuvers to secure the office that he craves, and yet all the way through his ascension to power, he seems to have these moments of genuine regret. He seems to have convinced himself that he can do enough good with political power that it's worth betraying some old friends, but the weight of each decision does seem to affect him. Sergeant Jay Landsman, seen all throughout the show as a cunning survivalist who sees bodies as numbers, has a moment of conscience where even he can't put Bubbles in prison for confessing to a murder because he determines that Bubbles is confessing because he feels guilty for failing to prevent the death.
Sad-ass motherfucker's carrying more weight than we'll ever put on him.
What about the clearance?
Fuck the clearance.
Even this hard-hearted bastard won't cross some lines in order to improve his stats. I mean, a couple episodes later, he's right back to his games. I mean, this is The Wire. What, do you think he was going to bring the Who's back their Christmas presents? Deputy Commissioner of Operations Irvin Burrell is seen all through the show as being willing to do whatever he has to do to gain the favor of City Hall, even if that means forcing investigations to a premature end because they're getting too close to unearthing political corruption. And yet when his journey ends and he's looking back at it, he seems remorseful. He seems to think that there was no other way he could have played his cards, and that if he hadn't done these things, then he would have just been replaced by somebody who would have.
To Carcetti, I'm a hack. Royce was no different. Maybe I am, but every day they send over a new priority. Go after the bad guys. No, change that. Make quality of life cases. Get on top of the murders. On second thought, run the whores out of Patterson Park.
A critical question to answer as a viewer of The Wire is whether the civic dysfunction that you're witnessing is a result of, quote, the bad guys being in charge, or if large organizations simply have an incentive structure that brings out people's lower tendencies. A fascinating juxtaposition to explore this question with is Hurc and another junior member of the Major Crimes Detail, Detective Ellis Carver. You're set up from the outset to think that they're fundamentally cut from the same cloth. They both represent the inevitable consequence of the war on drugs shift in police mentality. They both define success in policing as being to get what they can out of this, quote, war. They both want to crack heads and get medals, and for that matter to skim some cash off the top of the whole thing. You know, the spoils of war and all that. But something changes in Carver towards the end of the third season. Somebody points something out to him that he isn't able to ignore. It seems to eat at him. Maybe it was something that he always knew on some level but was able to hide from himself. But in any event, Carver makes a distinct turnaround in his career. He begins to think of his role as a police officer as being to reduce crime, not to make arrests or please his bosses. He recognizes that what's beneficial to his career is not the same thing as what's right or what constitutes effective policing. Over the course of the series, Hurc has no equivalent epiphany. He's basically the same person at the end of the series that he was in the beginning, so one way to explain this is that Carver's just one of the good guys and Hurc is one of the bad guys. And yet, the fact that they both started from the same place makes me want to test another hypothesis. Maybe Carver just has a little bit more self-awareness than Hurc.
Carver. He's a complicated man. The only one that understands him is his woman. Seek therapy.
Okay, yeah, let's explore that possibility a bit.
Who's the man that would risk his neck for his brother, man?
The talking to that totally changes Carver's perspective on policing comes from Major Bunny Colvin. When you first encounter him in the show, Colvin is wrapping up his career with Baltimore PD. He's spent 30 years in the streets, being promoted to commander of the Western District. And for all of that work, he's starting to feel like there was absolutely no point in any of it. He joined the force in 1974, when the war on drugs had yet to completely upend the previous model of police work in which patrolmen got to know people on their beat, build relationships with them, and use those bridges of trust to put away violent criminals. He watched over the course of his career as this model was phased out by the war on drugs model, in which every person on a cop's beat represents a potential criminal, where no bridge of trust is built and in which success is defined by arrests and seizures. He recognizes the futility of it all. He sees that no amount of buy-bust operations is going to do a damn thing to make the streets safer. He starts to wonder if any good whatsoever resulted from the 30 years that he gave the department. The one thing that he figures that he can do on his way out the door is to at least remind the young officers under his command that there is another way to do the job. And this is precisely why he reaches out to Carver, who he correctly identifies as a perfect specimen of the modern police officer, out to climb the ladder by locking people up and putting drugs on the table. He points something out to Carver that Carver isn't able to brush off. The problem with modeling police work after military conquest is that it makes combatants out of the people that the work is supposed to protect.
And when you're at war, you need a fucking enemy. And pretty soon, damn near everybody on every corner is your fucking enemy. And soon the neighborhood that you're supposed to be policing, that's just occupied territory.
Towards the end of his time with the department, Colvin delivers a speech to his younger officers about the long-standing practice of people concealing their alcoholic beverages in brown paper bags. This little gesture does something important. It gives police officers just enough plausible deniability so that they don't have to waste their shift taking people to lockup for the crime of cracking a cold one on their porch. It allows them to devote themselves to stopping actual crime, as opposed to wasting resources and burning bridges in the community by playing this absurd game of make-believe in which the Homer Simpsons of the world are actually criminal fucking masterminds. It's a message so simple and straightforward that anyone would get it.
Man, the shit with the bag? What the fuck is that?
Okay, almost anyone would get it. And Carver does seem to get it. His approach to police work from that point forward is one of relative leniency. He looks the other way on minor drug offenses where possible and seems to want to get to know the people on his beat. But for Colvin's words to have affected him this deeply, there has to have been some raw material there from the get-go. It couldn't have been that Carver in that moment just instantly discovered the concept of right and wrong. It could only be that Carver had tricked himself before that into seeing his upward mobility in the department as being for the greater good. Colvin just helped Carver to consciously recognize the contradiction inherent in his actions, and once Carver sees this contradiction, he's unable to unsee it. This just raises the question of how Carver failed to see this contradiction up until this point. It's a fascinating question that I think two features of human beings explain very well, and I'm going to explain both through a contrived device. For our purposes, let's simplify Maslow's hierarchy of needs and say that it has 3 levels. The low-level animalistic needs at the base related to pleasure and survival, the ego needs in the middle related to how we're perceived by others, and the higher needs at the top related to fulfillment and purpose. These 3 levels of the pyramid can roughly be thought of as 3 voices in our heads whose volumes are proportional to their areas. The voice of the animal screams at us. It tells us that if we lose our jobs, we'll lose our shelter and we'll freeze to death. The voice of the ego yells. It tells us that we ought to strive to be highly regarded and that our rank and position signals our worth to the world. The higher voice, though, well, it just sort of talks at a normal volume. It's frankly hard to hear it sometimes over the incessant noise of the lower voices. And yet it's there, telling us in its soft-spoken way that we ought to seek some purpose in our lives that's greater than simply servicing the lower two voices, that there ought to be some benefit to the world of our having existed. Well, the first feature of human beings that leads to this observed contradiction is that we imagine that we'll be able to silence the lower voices in our head by achieving some milestone. So what if I have to run a fake news story to get a Pulitzer Prize? The money and fame that I get from that will finally satisfy me and I won't be distracted anymore by the lower two voices. So really, if you think about it, the best thing that I can do is to run this fake story. Just think of all of the good journalism I'll do once I'm finally happy. It sounds stupid to say this, but just about everyone, myself included, has made the mistake of thinking that hitting milestone X in their lives will finally make the lower two voices shut the fuck up forever. We're enabled in thinking this way by the fact that when good things happen to us, those voices do shut up. For like a week, if that. And then they come back without fail and seem to be just as loud as ever, if not louder. Forget about human beings for a minute. For that matter, forget about complex organisms. For single-celled life to even get to be multicellular life, it had to master one thing. The tutorial boss for single cells was managing to stay the same internally despite changes in the external environment. The goo that we are made of hates internal change at a fundamental level. And so when some increase in wealth, status, or prestige fills us with feel-good chemicals, our bodies start to recalibrate our new living circumstances as being the new baseline. Your body will never tolerate you being away from baseline for an extended period of time if it can help it, and most people will therefore find that after moving into a new house or getting a new promotion, etc., that it takes about a week to go from feeling like they have tiger blood to feeling like Garfield on a Monday. And yet we persist in the belief that we can satisfy these fundamentally insatiable voices in our heads, that one more rush is all that they need to be quiet forever. The second reason that the Carver contradiction seems to be possible is more of a psychological phenomenon. In fact, it's so deeply ingrained in us that you can see it express itself perfectly in a famous experiment involving children. In the 1960s, psychologist Jonathan Friedman ran an experiment with boys aged 7 to 9. Two groups of boys were taken into a room containing 5 toys. 4 of them were intentionally boring, sort of ball in a cup type of toys, but one toy was way more interesting than the others by design. It was an elaborate robot, the exact type of toy that young boys are instinctively drawn to. Both groups of kids were left alone in the room with the toys, but not before Friedman gave them a warning. The first group of boys was told, "It's wrong to play with the robot. You'll be in big trouble if you play with the robot, and I'll be very mad at you." The second group of boys was simply told, "It's wrong to play with the robot," with none of the threats that followed. Unsurprisingly, for the most part, the kids in both groups avoided the robot when Friedman left the room. But the point of this experiment was to see how they behaved towards the robot weeks later when a completely different person brought them to the same room and gave them no instructions whatsoever regarding which toys to play with. The kids from the first group, who were threatened with hellish consequences if they played with the robot, overwhelmingly did play with the robot this time. But the second group of kids, who were simply told it's wrong to play with the robot, overwhelmingly refrained from playing with the robot. So what gives here? Both groups of kids were told that it's wrong to play with the robot, so why would the kids who were threatened on top of that be the ones to decide to play with the robot? Well, here's the important thing. For the kids who were simply told it's wrong to play with the robot, choosing to play with the robot on the second visit would require them to have an uncomfortable realization about themselves. They would have to consciously confront the fact that they didn't play with it the first time because they were afraid of Friedman. The first group of kids didn't have this limitation. They could simply tell themselves that they did the smart thing by not playing with the robot the first time, since it would have caused them problems. Mom would have gotten all mad. She probably would have grounded me for pissing off this weirdo science guy. Many of you will recognize this phenomenon as an example of what we now call cognitive dissonance. Referring again to the simplified Maslow's hierarchy, when we feel an inner conflict, we're good at telling ourselves that our lower voices are actually our higher voices. There are many famous examples of this phenomenon in adults that are more directly applicable to the characters and themes of The Wire, but I've chosen to mention this one because it drives home an important point. This phenomenon is not a quality of, quote, the bad guys. This is a tendency that's so baked into us that you can see it play out in children. They don't have mustaches to twirl, okay? No 8-year-old finishes an episode of Blue's Clues and then calls the Bogandovs to tell them to short the euro. You see these two human software bugs play out with dramatic consequences in the character of Tommy Carcetti. In my mind, Carcetti started his career in politics by mistaking his lower-level urges for money and status with his higher-level desires to do good, desires that I do genuinely believe that he has. This is cognitive dissonance, you know, the thing that we see play out in children. As he gets into his new role in city council, he starts by exercising his desire to help the citizens of Baltimore, but it's been like a week now and he's returning to baseline. The high is starting to fade. He again confuses his desire to get another rush of power with his genuine desire to do good things. He tells himself that as a council member, he's limited in his ability to help the police secure additional resources to do good work, since they're all terrified of signaling to the incumbent mayor that they've sidestepped him to gain assistance. I mean, come on, shouldn't he run for mayor? Once he convinces himself that his lower voices are actually his higher voice, it makes it easier to make moral compromises to secure the office. He nudges another council member, Tony Gray, into running for mayor specifically as a strategy to peel support away from Clarence Royce, the current incumbent. And he conceals this intention from him despite the fact that they're close friends. He also recruits the assistance of notorious state senator Clay Davis, a political parasite who's deeply involved with helping Baltimore's drug lords to launder their money through legitimate revenue sources. But remember though, he's doing it for a good reason, so it isn't wrong when he does it. And so Carcetti wins the mayoral race, largely by criticizing the last administration for cooking the books and covering up the true crime rate. Once he's the mayor though, he realizes that he's faced with an unavoidable political landmine.
So what's on your agenda today?
School audit.
Well, how bad could that be?
The system is running a $54 million deficit.
In order to cover this massive budget deficit, he's either going to have to go back on his campaign promise to increase funding for the police, or he's going to have to go to the state governor and beg for money. The only problem that this will cause him is that if he ever decides to run for governor, they'll run TV ads about how this is the guy who needed your funds to fix his own local mess. And that alarm means that the high of being the mayor has worn off. Carcetti wants to be the governor, and again he tells himself that it's because of all the good he could do from that position. He could solve Baltimore's budget problems with the stroke of a pen. He wouldn't be in this situation of having to choose between funding the schools and funding the police. Isn't a little pain right now worth fixing all these problems? But to get to the governor's mansion from his current position, Carcetti needs to appear to have succeeded as the mayor despite having a $50 million deficit to address. A simple way to achieve this is to bail on his promise to increase police funding, but without those funds, crime is likely to increase, and that's not good for somebody who campaigned on returning to real police work. It occurs to him that he won the mayoral race by criticizing the previous mayor for cooking the stats, but this time he figures that Baltimore really does just need a temporary band-aid. It'll all be worth fudging some numbers because the permanent fix is coming once he's in the big chair. And just like that, Tommy Carcetti is asking for cooked stats from the police department when his entire pitch for becoming the mayor was that he would stop this from happening. And I hope that I've made the point clear that at no point could we fail to explain his behavior outside of the lens of a physiological fact about human beings and a psychological tendency that's so universal that we observe it in children. Let's return to the question of whether Hurc and Carver are fundamentally different types of people. Is there any unique value that we can gain from the insight that Hurc is the other? Not in the slightest. We can absolutely still conclude that he ought to be kept away from positions of power regardless of the lens we view his actions through. But what price do we pay for entertaining this perspective? Well, whether we intend to or not, we're fundamentally validating the mindset that fuels the war on drugs. We're entertaining the idea that there are others. A case that The Wire makes loud and clear is that there is no other. The other is us. My most recent rewatching of The Wire was a process of learning to reappreciate it through a lens in which the main villain isn't some mustache twirler, the main villain is me. I was the big bad the whole time, and I frankly should have known this because it was established in the first line of dialogue in the show.
So your boy's name is what? Snot. You call the guy Snot?
Snot Boogie. Yeah.
I had a conflict between my higher values and my lower needs that I drowned out with alcohol and rationalized away by telling myself that all of the compromises would be worth it. The challenge for me in making this video is reconceiving of The Wire through a lens in which this tendency in human beings is the real antagonist. The Wire has a tendency to use direct scene juxtapositions, one right after the other, to drive home thematic connections. In one scene, a group of gangsters are discussing the need to retaliate after a rival gang killed one of their members, and in the very next scene, a group of kids are plotting revenge against another group of boys who attacked a member of their group. Here, in my mind, is the most important one of these scene juxtapositions in the entire series, and frankly, I have no idea if it was even intentional. In the first season, the major crimes detail goes to visit a group of FBI investigators to negotiate having federal assets dedicated to their case, since the brass in Baltimore is quickly losing interest in the case. The feds listen to their pleas, but it becomes clear that in their minds, the only angle worth pursuing here is political corruption, the fact that the organization has made campaign donations to State Senator Clay Davis and others like him. This infuriates the Baltimore cops. They can't believe that these eggheads don't see who the real villain is. It's clearly Avon Barksdale and Stringer Bell. I mean, isn't it? Sure, they're responsible for the murders and the drug distribution, but there also is the element of political corruption to look into. It gets at the heart of how this whole thing is financed. Maybe Clay Davis and people like him are the real villains. But if you've been watching this show the way that you should, trying to perceive its deeper messages, it should occur to you that there's a third villain in the room that nobody has recognized: institutional self-interest. The Baltimore cops think that the villain is the one that they will be able to pull resources to pursue, and the feds similarly think that the villain is the one that they can pull resources to pursue. Maybe the villain is the fact that when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But look at the scene that we immediately transition to. D'Angelo Barksdale, the nephew of ringleader Avon Barksdale, has been arrested and charged with transporting drugs across state lines. He ends up striking a bargain with the police, but it's not for leniency in his sentence, it's because he's become disgusted by the barbarity that's taken over the drug trade. When he learns that the higher-ups of the Barksdale organization had a junior member of his crew killed out of pure paranoia, in his mind that represented the crossing of an uncrossable line. He loses the ability to tell himself that it's all in the game. He realizes that his time with this organization is done one way or another. But after he agrees to testify against Avon, his mother visits him in prison. She reminds him of the fact that his family is completely dependent on the funds from the Barksdale organization, that it represents his own son's best shot at prosperity, and that he's nothing without his reputation and status with the gang.
You ain't got family in this world. What the hell you got?
And there it is right there. That's the main villain of the series. The main villain of the series is the tendency of human beings to prioritize their lower-level prerogatives over their higher values. D'Angelo does have a conscience, and he regrets his decision to walk back his agreement with the police. And yet, he makes the decision nonetheless. It's not immediately obvious how this leads to a positive takeaway. It might seem like it's less optimistic to say that the core problem is inside of every person. It would be way easier and more encouraging to say that our task is simply to identify the bad people and isolate them from power. But I'll just reiterate an earlier point. The job of an optimistic work of fiction is not to tell us that things are better than we think they are. The most meaningful works of fiction give us clarity and purpose when we're overwhelmed. They help us to identify what is under our control and to help us focus on it. One of the most helpful things that a work of fiction can do is to show you what lies ahead if you continue on the path of expediency, and to show you that it is possible to live in accordance with your higher values, even if the means aren't extremely obvious. The tendency to see The Wire as a doom and gloom show is easy to understand. In the streets, it's brutality and ruthlessness that seem to triumph. You see this in the rise of Marlo Stanfield. In the police department, it's ass-kissing and making the stats that gets you promoted. In the school system, your success depends on maintaining a distance from the very kids that you hopefully enter the profession because of a desire to help. And yet, in all of these institutions, people do real, meaningful work that broadly benefits the world. Also, it isn't true as a law that the bad rise and the good fall. Careerists do get their comeuppances. Those with a desire to do good do find opportunities to exercise this drive. And there are cases where the cessation of dark urges and the willingness to trust and cooperate reveal themselves to be the best strategy. I'm going to make the case that these aren't just random events, that they follow a real discernible pattern with an actionable takeaway. And as a cherry on top, in performing this analysis, I'll be able to introduce a fan-favorite character, one that many people have doubtless started to wonder how the fuck a video this long about The Wire hasn't already brought up. What, if anything, is the takeaway from the character of Omar Little, the Robin Hood figure who makes his living robbing drug organizations like the Barksdales? How is it that an organization as disciplined, structured, and connected as the Barksdales ends up having their greatest problem not be a police investigation, a supply and distribution issue, or a rival gang, but rather a guy? A guy who becomes so feared in the streets that during an unarmed walk to the corner store to get cereal, he accidentally ends up robbing a stash house. Let's revisit the simplified Maslow's hierarchy. Assume for the sake of simplicity that we all have three voices in our heads: the animal, the ego, and the higher self. What the power struggles of Baltimore show us can be interpreted as random, which is just depressing. But here's a lens that I think makes things snap into place. The more of these voices that you need satisfied by your job, the more peril you stand to face. Frank Sobotka is an example of somebody who needs all three levels of Maslow's hierarchy satisfied by his job, and I think that virtually all viewers of the show instinctively know that the writing is just on the wall for Frank. He feels this intense pain of the loss of community and structure that the longshoreman profession used to bring to Baltimore. He's killed inside by the fear that this will disappear, leaving him to figure out who he is outside of his profession. He also needs this job to provide for himself and for the people in his organization. But his ultimate weakness, the thing that dooms him in the end, is that he has a conscience. He hears his higher voice loud and clear, and it tells him that the organization supplying him with the means to continue funding the union and his political donations is bad news, that in order to do what they want, he'll have to cross lines that simply cannot be crossed. What can seem nihilistic about the show is the fact that Sobotka, needing all three levels of the hierarchy satisfied by his job, is never going to survive against a group that sees everything as an Excel spreadsheet. When Frank meets the Greek, the leader of the organization running drugs and people through his docks, the Greek doesn't even know what to make of Frank. He assumes that Frank is operating from the same priorities as him. To the Greek, this whole thing is business, plain and simple.
You should go out and spend some of the money on something you can touch. New car, new coat. It's why we get up in the morning,
Frank's pesky need for his job to satisfy all three levels of his hierarchy of needs puts him in a position where he's too compromised to seek help from the police, and yet too stuck in his morals to be able to maintain the detachment he would need to continue profiting from his relationship with the Greek. A realization that can lead you to the conclusion that The Wire is a pessimistic show is the simple fact that Frank Sobotka would have been better off without that pesky higher voice. This reality plays itself out all over The Wire. Critically, you see this dynamic at work within criminal organizations. D'Angelo Barksdale, like Frank Sobotka, is pinned at every level of Maslow's hierarchy. He needs far too many things from his job to have any shot at lasting in a profession where the most successful people are operating from the lower levels of the hierarchy. But it isn't as simple as to say that a moral voice is a hindrance in large organizations. If we view the series through this lens, it becomes obvious that the trend continues all the way down the pyramid. A very clear way that you see this is in the juxtaposition of the leadership styles of Avon Barksdale and Stringer Bell. In the second and third seasons of the show, the Barksdale organization goes through something like a crisis of vision. Avon and Stringer, sort of the CEO and vice president of the Barksdale crew, are at odds about the best way to continue the organization that they built together. Since the organization's inception, Stringer has overseen what you might call its corporate structure. He manages its communications infrastructure, and he developed the pager and later the payphone-based methods of maintaining covert communications. He performs the majority of the on-site quality control inspections, allowing Avon to stay shielded from the day-to-day. And maybe most critically, he oversaw the diversification of the gang's assets into semi-legitimate revenue sources such as Orlando's nightclub. He even started to dip his toes into real estate development through his connection with Clay Davis, seeing a future in which he and Avon could dump their money into below-market value real estate that would eventually earn them way more than selling drugs. You see, to Stringer, this was always about the money. He mixed his duties as the operations lead in the organization with taking business and economics classes at the local community college because he always saw this crime racket as a way to make money. He sees this chapter in his life as a stepping stone to something else, just part of his journey to unimaginable wealth. Stringer operates from the base level of Maslow's hierarchy. He just wants to live a life of luxury and abundance, to hell with everything else. But Avon has a very different perspective. He agrees with Stringer to a degree, but he's very much concerned with maintaining his territorial holdings out of pure pride.
Yeah, I ain't no suit-wearing businessman like you. You know, I'm just a gangster, I suppose. And I want my corners.
Avon is operating from the bottom 2 levels of the hierarchy. He wants to enjoy the fruits of his labor, but he also isn't content to become a straight businessman. He wants his name to ring out in the streets. He wants it to strike fear in the hearts of his rivals. When Major Crime succeeds in putting Avon behind bars at the end of the first season, it puts Stringer into a more central role in running the operation. He is now the de facto leader and organizer of the Barksdale crew. His first challenge to overcome is that their previous drug connection dried up when Avon went to prison. This puts him in a tough spot. He has all of this territory, but no good product to sell in it, which forces him to purchase inferior product at a worse price out of pure desperation. Soon, the organization is forced to degrade this already low-quality heroin to such a degree in order to maintain profitability that it risks totally alienating the customer base. This is when the East Side Baltimore gangs reach out to Stringer through Proposition Joe. They have the opposite problem. They have excellent product through their connection to the Greek, but no good real estate with which to sell it. Joe tells Stringer that they can both benefit more by cooperating than they can by competing. If Stringer lets the East Side use their towers to sell heroin, Joe will include Stringer into their supply line of that heroin, which is a far superior product at a bulk discounted price. Stringer crunches the numbers and realizes that the move makes perfect sense. It's a genius business maneuver. If they stop fighting other gangs, it means that there's no bodies to motivate police scrutiny. If all of their business is concentrated in the towers, they don't have to fight with rival gangs over the corners, including a new upstart who's really looking to expand his territory in the power vacuum that Avon's departure left. But the problem is that Avon just isn't hearing it. He fought for his corners and his towers, and he fears that he'll look weak if he cedes the territory. When he returns from prison in Season 3 after a cleverly orchestrated scheme to gain early parole, he's almost immediately at odds with Stringer. Stringer tries and tries to make him see the perfection of his business plan.
We didn't think we'll make it this fucking far, but fuck if we ain't standing here right now with the whole world at our feet. The whole world, man, not these fucking corners.
But Avon can't see the world through any lens other than his status as the top dog of the West Side. It's core to his sense of self. This rivalry tells him who he is. And as Marlo Stanfield emerges onto the scene, the differences in the visions of Avon and Stringer become a source of outright conflict. From Stringer's perspective, fighting with Marlo for irrelevant corners has zero benefit to the organization. It just brings police scrutiny. They should just let him have his corners. It's what he really wants, and he'll be cut out of the good drug connection, which means he won't eat into their profits in any meaningful way. But to Avon, this is a bridge too far. He mocks Stringer for thinking that someday he'll be some tycoon. He tells him that they came from the street, and the street is where they'll die.
Whoa, man, we passed this bullshit.
Yeah, I forgot. You know, I knew I forgot something. We the Trump brothers.
He decides to participate in the war with Marlo, which predictably brings the exact type of police scrutiny that Stringer warned about. Prop Joe tells him that unless they manage to end this shit, their business arrangement is gonna come to an end, and the East Side will cut them out of the good drug connection. He makes one last attempt to go to Avon to make him see the error of his ways, to tell him that everything that they've built is at risk if he continues on this path. He just needs him to see that this is futile and that there's a better way things can be done. He just fuck, he's playing with a grenade. That's not a good sign. Not a good sign that Avon has a grenade. Fuck, where do you even get a grenade? This conflict of visions ultimately predicts the downfall of the Barksdale organization, and the irony of it is that if Stringer had just been able to run things by his vision, it probably would have worked. Marlo would have drawn all of the heat, and he could have continued raking in the dough with superior product and territory. His biggest enemies would have become vultures like Clay Davis milking him for building permits, but it was Avon's approach that alienated the East Side drug connection, and that forced Stringer to take actions that ultimately drew the wrath of the last guy in Baltimore that you want coming after you. While the Barksdales fall in Season 3, the East Side-West Side co-op lives on. It shows us the final vision of what Stringer's approach could have been for the Barksdale organization. Stringer had started turning the organization into a semi-legitimate business, to the point that the gang meetings were marked by these games of chair recognizes and were structured more like business meetings.
Yeah.
Do the chair know we gonna look like some punk-ass bitches out there?
Motherfucker, out!
This is taken to its logical extreme by the co-op. They get to the point that they're having their meetings in hotel conference rooms with literal fucking signage posted. They've managed to do this because they've so minimalized the violent footprint of their work, and they have their money laundering pipelines so well established that they have credible cover for their dirty money. The entire thing works like a business. This approach is clearly superior to the hybrid approach of Avon Barksdale, which was inherently internally conflicted. The co-op lacks this inner tension. To them, this whole thing is about the money. But you know who else lacks an inner conflict? Marlo Stanfield. You see, it's not as simple as saying that you do better in The Wire the less you need from your job. You also do better the higher up in the hierarchy you shift your primary driving motivation. People have a hard time predicting you. They can only try to anticipate your moves by imagining what they would do. And the New Day co-op, who are stuck at level 1 of the hierarchy chasing animal satisfactions like security and pleasure, are catastrophically unprepared to deal with somebody who purely wishes for the crown with none of the jewels associated with it. The co-op, with its Walmart approach to diversification and violence minimalization, basically never stood a chance against Marlowe's crew, a lean and ruthless group of West Baltimore soldiers with a single-minded vision, ruling the West Side drug trade at whatever cost.
Prison and graveyards, full of boys who wore the crown.
Point is, they wore it.
Everyone in the co-op assumes that Marlo must be like a young Avon, just stuck in the war game part of the rise to power, failing to see the earning opportunities that come from cooperation. Even Stringer makes this misread, and so they all try to bargain with Marlo the way that Stringer tried to bargain with Avon, by telling him that he'll make more money with the co-op than he will on his own. They see Marlo as though he's fundamentally like them, just more violent and less refined, so they try to appeal to him the way that somebody could appeal to them. But as they'll soon learn, Marlo isn't like them at all.
The point of the co-op is we stand together. We share information, and no one fucks with any of us.
No one fucks with me now.
While Joe sees Marlo as someone with some rough edges that he can civilize through co-op membership, Marlo's only regard for Joe is that he's standing in his way of being the top dog in West Baltimore. But Marlo is also a very cunning strategist. He sets to taking over and dismantling the co-op internally rather than conquering it conventionally. Marlo sends out false signals that he intends to play ball and join the co-op, and while Joe and company scheme to introduce opportunities to let Marlo see how much better life is in the co-op, Marlo just gets right down to studying how it all works, where the drugs come from, how Joe manages to launder the money, etc. He studies its operations until he learns how to independently access the Greeks' drug connection and how to launder his own money without Joe's help. It then becomes strategically viable to eliminate Joe and replace him as the head of the co-op, since Joe's death means that now only he has access to the Greeks. The co-op never stood a chance against Marlo, but this trend continues with an exploration of who was a major pain in the ass to Marlo. The answer was the same as it was for the Barksdales: Omar Little.
That's my money.
Man, money ain't got no owners, only spenders.
Omar, over most of the course of the show, is weirdly like its most self-actualized character. He makes his living robbing stash houses, primarily in Baltimore's West Side, but he gets around. Omar is intrinsically motivated. He doesn't seem to care in the slightest for the money, and in fact, he gives most of it away. He doesn't seem to be interested in developing or defending a reputation. It doesn't seem to bother him in the slightest that people drag his name in the dirt and spread rumors about him.
You walk the streets of Baltimore with a gun, taking what you want when you want it, willing to use violence when your demands aren't met. This is who you are.
He knows exactly who he is, and he's quite comfortable in his own skin. He just likes robbing drug dealers. He sees it as fair game. But importantly, these are the only people who he sees robbing as fair game. Omar lives by a rigidly defined moral code. When he visits Prop Joe to offer to sell him back the drugs that he stole from him, he insists on paying for the clock that Joe repaired. This repair falls within the legitimate economy. Joe rendered him a service, and he's therefore owed compensation. Omar is the only judge of himself that he cares for at all. He does what he loves doing without the faintest of cares what anyone else thinks about him. And man, oh man, is he good at what he does. Nobody working from the lower levels of Maslow's hierarchy stands a chance against Omar. None of his moves can be predicted from the perspective of someone who sees everything as being about money or pride. Omar is ruthlessly patient and calculating. He watches and waits, picking the perfect windows to perform a stash house raid. Nobody ever sees him coming, when he's operating on his own terms. As his friend Butch tells him in the show, the key to his success is his ego detachment. In his line of work, getting into the mindset of making a vendetta personal is a fatal mistake. The only way that anyone in the show is able to make Omar predictable is by bringing him down to their level, by hurting someone close to Omar so that he's made to operate on a level of the hierarchy that they understand. This does make Omar predictable. The only two times that we see him in a dangerous position are times that because Omar had been baited by a need for revenge, his presence was predictable. Omar's fall in the show is one of its saddest arcs. The loss of his detachment weakened him and made him a mere mortal. And while it's difficult to watch, it does provide you with a stark contrast that sells the following message. When you operate from the highest level of Maslow's hierarchy, nobody's able to really predict or combat you. You end up playing your own game, competing for resources that nobody else perceives or has the potential to access. The danger to Marlo Stanfield was never going to come from anyone operating lower down the hierarchy than him. Just like the co-op couldn't predict the moves of Marlo Stanfield, Marlo couldn't predict the moves of Omar. Marlo also couldn't predict the moves of a very small number of committed idealists in the police department, who managed to navigate all of the roadblocks associated with large organizations to carry out a sustained, thorough investigation of his organization. The Wire shows us that it is possible to live in accordance with your higher values, both as an independent actor and as a member of a large organization. It lays out compelling cases for pursuing both courses, showing the unique advantages and disadvantages of both approaches. By far, the season that offers the most in-depth commentary on the benefits and drawbacks of both strategies is the 4th season, which deep dives into the major institutional roadblocks affecting the school system. On a deeper level though, what the 4th season really shows is that the most destructive numbers games that the city of Baltimore plays are the ones that are harmful to the lives of children. This is true because children are blameless for their circumstances and lack any agency in improving their lives, but the other thing that's critical to understand is that the harm that these numbers games cause to children leaves them desperate for anything to fill the void of a family. There's a scene in the 3rd season where a group of troubled kids are taken to a city morgue in order to be scared straight. A policeman shows them the corpses of slain gangsters and tries to give them the "this could be you" talk. This is a fantastic strategy if the way that kids end up in crime is by the type of calculation that someone makes when choosing their medical specialty. You know, I really just think I'd enjoy the work-life balance that selling heroin offers and the hours work around my hobbies. It's a catastrophic error to fail to see that something else is going on with kids and teens who are considering life in gangs. Let's consider the case of Wallace, a young teen who joins the Barksdale organization as a low-level drug dealer towards the outset of the show. Wallace, at the age of 16, is effectively the head of his household. He is solely responsible for the care and supervision of a group of neighborhood kids, some of whom may be his siblings. Wallace has an obvious need for money, which the job provides him with. What's harder to understand, though, is why he feels so stuck in his position. You find out really early on that Wallace is not cut out for life in gangs. He has a strong moral compass, and he finds the violent elements of the work extremely upsetting. He's also a smart kid, which would lead you to believe he has plenty of options outside of gang life should he choose to pursue them.
That shit look green to you?
Got a dead fucking president on it.
Nigga, I don't give a fuck about the president. That shit ain't money. He ain't no president. What you mean? Hamilton? He ain't no president.
But a tragedy befalls Wallace. It's made clear to him that his best course of action is to leave the gang because the ongoing police investigation is causing all kinds of paranoia within the organization. They don't know at this point that they've been wiretapped, and so they start considering whether the police attention that they're getting is being guided by people within the organization snitching. Wallace stands out like a sore thumb as someone who hasn't drank the organization's Kool-Aid, someone with moral qualms about the whole thing, and so he's advised to get out of Dodge before things get out of hand. And yet Wallace is just unable to stay away. After a brief hiatus of living with his grandmother in Cambridge, he makes his way back to the West Side Projects, seemingly hoping that the violence and ruthlessness that he's seen in the gang makes an exception for him. It seems that he does this because without having his place in the gang, he doesn't know what to make of himself. He feels a deep void within himself that the gang has helped him to fill. It gives him a way of interpreting the world in a way that he understands, that he has a place in.
Shit, if it ain't up in the West Side, I don't know shit, yo. Cause this is me, yo. Right here.
Here's the most important part of the riddle that is the tragedy of Baltimore. What needs do children have that gang life uniquely seems to provide them with? One deep need that every child has is a need to have a logical, understandable relationship with consequence and hostility. They can't stand to have their lives be this perpetual chaos in which everything and everyone around them can harm them with seemingly no warning or reason. Fathers usually provide this feeling to their kids. They make an agreement with their children, and especially their boys once they're teenaged. You bend your aggressive, status-seeking urges to me. I am the authority, but part of this bargain is that I'll shield you from danger. I'm the authority and I have rules, but I'm the only one who gets to tell you what to do. The rest of the world is stopped at the door and I'm the guard. You get to sleep soundly at night because I'm watching it. I'll also show you what to do with these status-seeking violent urges that you're feeling. I'll teach you how to use them productively in a way that brings benefit to the people around you rather than harm. The kids growing up in Baltimore's projects have mostly been raised without father figures. They've been raised by their mothers, aunts, and grandmothers in houses with strained resources and in many cases lots of other kids. In these environments, all that the adults can frequently provide the kids is pure survival, food on the table and a bed to sleep in. To add to this, a lot of these kids' parents are addicted to drugs in a way that not only makes them unreliable as protectors, in a lot of cases it brings people into the living arrangement that add to the danger that the kids feel. Complicating things even further, when the young boys hit the age of 12 or so, they're bombarded by this hormone surge that tells them that they need to start asserting dominance. Even within their friend groups, they start to develop these social dynamics of who is the leader, largely based around who's willing to violently represent the interests of the group. For a lot of kids, life in gangs offers them the closest thing that they've ever had to a traditional family. It establishes rules of who's allowed to harm you and consequences for when people harm you out of turn. It also tells you where you are in the pecking order. It establishes who you're able to boss around, satisfying that part of young boys in particular that craves a sense of status and power.
Hey, yo, Pooh! You the man for an hour.
Shit, look at me.
But gang life is not the same as a traditional family life. It offers a brutal double-edged sword. You get big benefits if you cooperate with us. You get to be in on a lifestyle. You get rewards and experiences that you wouldn't otherwise get, and you get to live with a sense that you're somebody. You get to know where the danger in your life is. It's not swirling around you anymore, it's in front of you, and you aren't facing it alone. But here's the catch. You'd best not even fucking think of bending to any other authority. You'd best not carry yourself in a way that even hints that you're susceptible to being turned. You can't show any sign of weakness whatsoever because that signals to the gang that you have a point of leverage that somebody can exploit. These kids are reared in an environment in which it's made clear to them that they need at all costs to avoid sending any message that they're weak. D'Angelo tells this to Wallace after Wallace disappears to his grandma's house for a period.
If anybody asks you whether you're in this game, you tell them you're in it for life. All right? You play it hard, you play it tight, and you make sure niggas know you're gonna stand by your people. No loose talk, no second thoughts, and no snitching.
The members of the drug organizations that we see in the show are deeply aware of the fact that at all times they're being watched, that the people below them are sizing them up to sense weakness that they can exploit, and the people above them are watching like hawks for any sense of wavering. Bodie and Poot, two of Wallace's more senior gang members, are pinned by this exact reality. They're friends with Wallace and they like him. But when Stringer informs them that Wallace has become a liability, they're just trapped. If they don't follow through with what Stringer has asked of them, they'll have committed the exact same mistake that Wallace made, deviating from the gang just far enough to draw its wrath, but not far enough to gain meaningful support on the other side. In the lives of the kids that we see in The Wire, it's commonplace that just about every adult in their lives is lying to them. Their parents lie to them and spend their money on drugs. Undercover cops lie and say they just want to buy drugs. Rival gangs lie. Fellow gang members lie and say that they had their package stolen. Their entire existence requires that they be good at sussing out people's intentions. Someone who's too nice buying drugs is probably an undercover cop, and someone telling you to go check something out around the corner could be setting you up for an ambush. Gangs therefore have a very easy time making the following pitch. We are the only ones that you can trust. Everyone else is trying to use you. Their signals of wanting to help you are just there to make you weak, and they'll use that weakness against you if you drop your guard. When these kids arrive in the school system, these barriers have to first be addressed before any progress can be made, and none of them are navigable unless the teachers can convince the kids that they aren't trying to use them, that their words aren't empty fluff, and that the structure will be there for them if they face consequences of losing status with their group. Any perception of dishonesty on the part of the kids can reset this bridge building process to stage 0. These kids know that the worst mistake that they can make is losing status with their peers to gain the favor of an education system whose only interest in them is to use them to pad their test scores and then kick them out the door to go deal with the consequences. This is strikingly different from the environment that most of us grew up in. Just think of how crazy this is. When I say in 1492, you just complete the sentence. Now, you most likely learned this around the age of 10, and I don't know what you were interested in at the age of 10, but I'm gonna take a guess that it wasn't 15th century Spanish maritime activity. When I was 10 years old, my interests were who has the rarest Charizard and figuring out if Timmy really did meet Michael Jordan at Disneyland, or if he's a lying piece of shit who also probably stole my Omega. I know it was him. He was always looking at it. There was a bridge of trust that existed for us. We agreed to suspend our spitball fights and to sit still while an adult that we had never met listed the dates of naval voyages. This bridge of trust started with our family structure, the rule set that we lived under for our entire lives that provided us with our sense of safety and sense of self, told us that we needed to sit down and shut up anytime that this weirdo started talking about old wooden boats. They told us that their approval of us was meaningful, and we believed them because we had every reason to. But the kids who are starting school in Baltimore have no such trust bridge. To the contrary, they've not only been told that everyone is out to get them, but most of their lives have reinforced this idea. Roland Presbolewski, a former member of the major crimes detail that put Avon Barksdale behind bars in the first season, is by the fourth season working as a new teacher at Edward Tillman Middle School. He recognizes very quickly that his students fundamentally don't connect to the material that he's teaching, that they lack any sense that they'll benefit whatsoever from either his instruction or his approval. He begins to entertain the idea that these kids are just indifferent to him, but he has a critical realization during a class exercise in which he wants to ascertain how one of his students was able to correctly solve a math problem.
Blah, blah. Then you went like thinking all around this one and no other one. So the answer is B5. Everybody get that? B5, it got all the dinks.
This isn't just a comedic scene, it's deeply revelatory. These kids aren't indifferent to Prez at all. In fact, they're studying him quite closely. It's just that it isn't his words that interest them. What interests them is figuring out what his words signal about his intentions. A fundamental trust barrier exists, and he realizes that this is the first bridge that he has to cross if he's to achieve any success with these kids. Like Presbolewski, Major Colvin has left the police force and by the fourth season is working with a special educational program piloted by a group of academics from the University of Maryland. The purpose of this program is to intervene in the lives of corner kids who are so beyond the apparent point of reachability that the school system had essentially written them off as lost causes. They're willing to allow these academics to experiment with these kids because it brings them grant money and because, frankly, getting these kids out of normal classes represents their best shot at getting the other kids to behave.
I don't even know nothing about the damn book. And you always getting on my ass and shit about some book.
Early in the program, they meet a hyper-exaggerated form of resistance. Their prospective recruits loudly signal that they have no intention of cooperating whatsoever with any dumb special class. This hostility and indifference persists until there's a brilliant move made by one of the academics. She tells these kids that the word in school is that they're just too bad to be in the other classes, and so the school just gave up and decided to let them hang out. Now they have cover. It's not that they're in here snitching, they're here because they're too bad for normal classes. The next thing that this team does is to approach the subject matter in a way that doesn't trigger an immediate sense to these kids that they're being lied to. They don't get started by trying to make them memorize lines from Macbeth. They get started asking them about the details of their own lives. They ask them questions like, what qualities make a good drug dealer?
Keep your eyes open.
Keep the count straight.
Don't trust nobody.
And look what happens to these previously combative kids. They settle down and start having a real discussion. They've had the fear of losing rep reduced. They've gotten over the fear that just being in this room makes them suspicious to their peers. And furthermore, the teachers aren't trying to jam skills that they don't think they'll ever need down their throats. The teachers seem to want to know what they can learn from them. This is the first time that you see this group of kids act with decorum. They even take turns talking. But it isn't all smooth sailing. One of the younger kids in the class, Albert, still has a very difficult time adjusting to the class. He remains evasive and even combative. As the class progresses, you ultimately discover that he does this as a defense mechanism because he has a horribly traumatic home life. On the day of a particularly bad outburst, Colvin takes him to a private office and he learns what he was trying to hide behind this facade. Albert's mother was a drug addict, and on the day of this outburst, she had died of an overdose, but his grandmother made him go to school anyways. Albert couldn't show this vulnerability to the class, and yet enough of a bridge of trust had been built with Colvin that he was willing to share it with him.
Yeah, you wanted to be with your mom. Of course you did.
It's an unbelievably huge sign of progress that Albert trusts Colvin enough to show him his pain, to show him that his act was just an act meant to conceal fear and pain. It reveals that he knows that Colvin isn't going to try to use this revelation against him, and even if that's all that Colvin has accomplished with Albert, it's unbelievably massive progress. But pressure soon reaches Colvin and his team in the form of the area superintendent, who's come to the school to see how well it's preparing for the upcoming statewide exams. You see, in the era of the No Child Left Behind Act, Edward Tillman Middle School will face very serious consequences if they fail to get their students to do well on these tests. From the perspective of the superintendent, the purpose of Colvin's special class was to get these kids into a cooperative enough state that they could be made to cram for the statewide test, and that was basically it. She wanted them to be brought to the point that she could use them for her own career mobility, even if it means compromising an educational program that was just starting to make headway. Colvin knows the futility of this. His kids are just starting to build the bridge of trust. They haven't bought the premise yet that Colvin will offer them enough guidance and protection to justify turning on their old lives, but they have bought that he's not out to get them. He knows that the second they switch up the lesson plan to be all about the statewide test, that these kids will smell a rat immediately. To tell them that they need to focus on the statewide test is a lie, and these kids are prone to shutting down if they sense that they're being lied to. On top of that, they are the hardest kids in the world to lie to successfully.
We can't lie. Not to them.
In his own teaching, Przewalski is beginning to arrive at much the same conclusion as Colvin. His biggest obstacle is a trust barrier and the fact that so many of these kids have been reared in environments in which trusting the wrong person is a life or death mistake. If his kids sense any dishonesty from him whatsoever, they're gonna ignore him completely and use class time as a low-stakes environment to practice the skills that they actually think they'll need. Prez realizes that he can only benefit these kids by offering them something they want enough to tempt them to forego the benefit that they can get on their own by bucking the rules, and so he structures his lessons around things that they can relate to. He teaches them principles of mathematics through playing games of dice. He starts seizing opportunities to step into his students' lives and to show them that he's genuinely interested. He knows that one of his students, Randy Wagstaff, is right on the edge of considering finding work on the corners, so he offers to help Randy run his side hustle as a lunchroom candy vendor by purchasing bulk candy for him online under the strict rule that the money to buy the candy does not come from the corners. Hilariously, Randy makes the initial startup money by playing dice, applying the knowledge of probability that he learned in Prez's class.
I ain't never seen you in a game before. Where you learn your game?
Edward Tillman Middle.
And yet, Prez faces the same problem that Colvin faced. No Child Left Behind standards dictate that Prez has to dedicate a majority of his class time to preparing his kids for the statewide test, and he's told that he has to start teaching test questions directly. On top of that, he has to start teaching language arts test questions in his math class, since that's where the school struggles the most. This is coming his way right as he was starting to build bridges with his students, and just like Colvin, he knows how counterproductive this is. It reminds him of the ways that the police department prioritized numbers in a way that made one forget what the point of the numbers was even supposed to be. And yet he understands that there's a unique tragedy to this numbers game in particular. It will reset the bridge building process that he's worked so hard to start. He seriously contemplates saying to hell with the whole thing and just sticking to his own lesson plan. But at the end of the day, Pryzbylewski has an important realization. In his position, no matter how good of a job he does, his kids eventually graduate and move beyond his ability to help them. There's no outcome on the table in which he'll ever be able to go the distance with any of his students. He has a year with them and then they travel on without him no matter what. He therefore accepts that the only result of refusing to compromise with the system is that he lose the ability to have the positive impact that he currently has. Prez and Colvin, acting inside of their current roles, can only practically expect to demonstrate to their kids that not everyone is out to get them. This is necessary but insufficient to getting these kids to the other side, to life outside of gangs. These kids need this idea reinforced in a multitude of places, and they need people who can be more persistent, interested figures in their lives, who they believe will go to bat for them when it matters. One figure who comes to be able to fill this role is Dennis Wise, a member of the Barksdale organization who you first encounter at the start of Season 3, as his 14-year stay in prison has come to its final day. Dennis is the stuff of legend within the organization. His work for the Barksdales granted him a reputation as a fearless soldier willing to do whatever the organization required of him. Avon is understandably interested in retaining his services once he's back on the streets, and he makes arrangements for him to rejoin the crew once he's free. But Dennis discovers that something has shifted in his inner priorities. The streets aren't the way that he remembers them. There seems to be nothing remaining of the code of honor that he remembers from the time of his youth. The game seems somehow to have changed in a way that doesn't sit well with him. Dennis confronts a conflict inside of himself. He realizes that he can either continue to work with the gang or preserve his value structure. There's no way for him to make the two compatible. And so he decides to start his life from scratch as a boxing coach for misguided youths. He may have learned to box during his time in the Jessup Penitentiary as a survival mechanism, but he realizes that the discipline that he learned in pursuing this interest has benefited him in more ways than simply knowing how to fight. It's his desire to present this discipline to the fatherless teens of Baltimore's inner city as an alternative to gang life, to be a persistent figure in their lives that can both show them an alternative vision of who they can be and who can stay with them over time, to shield them from danger and provide them with a safe space to learn and grow. One of the students who frequents his gym is a student from Major Colvin's special class, Naaman Bryce. Naaman is already starting his career in drug trafficking, but he's still young and moldable, so like Colvin, Dennis sets to trying to get through to him, to instill in him a sense that he does have other options outside of crime. And while Dennis ultimately isn't able to do this on his own, he does, along with Colvin, start to plant the seeds of the idea in Naaman's mind that not everyone outside of the gang is trying to use him. Let's return to Carver, who in the 4th season is a sergeant in the Western District's Drug Enforcement Unit. Colvin's lecture seems to have really stayed with him. He seems to have based his entire policing strategy around applying its takeaways. And chief among them is to stop thinking purely in the short term. He's realized that if he refrains from cracking heads every time someone wants to score some dope, that people will lower their guard around him to the point that he can start to piece together who these people are. He starts to refrain from making small-time busts, especially when the perpetrators are young.
I like to think that until the handcuffs actually fit, there's still talking to be done. Come here, man, let's take a walk. Spanky.
He tries this approach with Naaman, who he knows is a member of a group of juvenile delinquents who are just starting to dip their toes into crime. He warns him to straighten the fuck up and fly right so that he doesn't have to bust him. He reminds him that he can only look the other way so many times. But the problem is that there's something about Naaman that Carver doesn't know. His father is Weebay, a lieutenant from the Barksdale organization who ended the 1st season by confessing to every open murder charge on the books in which the Barksdales were suspected, even the ones that he didn't commit. You see, Weebay is what you'd call a company man. His entire sense of self derives from his place in the Barksdale organization, and Naaman has grown up knowing that he's expected to follow in his father's footsteps. His mother, who's one of the most repugnant figures in the entire show, berates him for showing hesitancy because she knows that he's already starting to waver. Naaman is afraid of life in the streets. He hates violence, and he feels a sense of disgust towards the nature of his work. But like D'Angelo, he's fighting an inner war. What about his family? What about his responsibility? After Carver's threat, he wants to stop, but his mother manipulates him into resuming his work by telling him that his father wouldn't have shrugged off his responsibility because his father is a real man. And so Naaman returns to the corners, which means that Carver has to bust him. But because of his experience in Colvin's class and his time in Dennis's boxing gym, the initial steps of the Bridge of Trust are there. He's willing to entertain the thought that showing vulnerability won't automatically be used against him. His willingness to show vulnerability is what allows Carver to make an important realization. A frightened child had been hiding underneath this facade of a hardened criminal the entire time, and knowing this, Carver feels more inclined to do what he can to help him rather than slap the bracelets on him. Carver agrees to let him sleep in the police station for the night so that he can avoid juvenile booking, and he reaches out to Major Colvin the next day to see if he can take him into his custody since his mother is out of town. This is what paves the final stones of his Bridge of Trust. He now can't ignore the pattern that he's observed of people outside of the gang seeming to want what's best for him. Dennis, Carver, and Colvin haven't just told Naaman that they'll go to bat for him, they've actually done it, and they've done it with no possible motive aside from wanting to protect him. This allows him to finally confide to Dennis during a visit to his gym that he's terrified of going home, that he doesn't want to continue living life the way that he has, and that he's desperate for someone to provide him with an alternative. This sparks a series of events leading to Colvin taking over as his custodial guardian.
You asking too much. Yeah, but I'm asking.
To Colvin, helping Naaman was a high personal priority. He had lived through this tremendous inner pain of trying for more than 30 years to help people from within large organizations, only to find that those organizations always squashed his efforts with one numbers game or another. Colvin finally just said, "God damn it, I'm gonna make one good thing come from my career. I'm gonna do one thing that no pencil pusher can ruin." It means that Naaman has someone to turn to who wants what's good for him to a degree that balances out how badly others want to hurt him. And yet, as hopeful as the situation with Naaman and Colvin is, there just aren't enough Colvins to go around. There aren't enough dissatisfied 30-year police veterans who want to confront their inner turmoil by adopting and mentoring a teenager. In Baltimore, at the end of the day, most of the people that we see needing help are not going to find someone who will restructure their lives around helping them. What they need is someone who can help them help themselves, someone who can scale this principle and offer them consistent guidance, someone who's been through what they've been through, someone who, like Colvin, gets something out of the experience. Bubbles is probably the greatest example of this idea in the show, to the point that I'd make the argument that it's what he exists in the show to illustrate. Bubbles struggles through the entire show with an inner anguish of seeing his drug addiction hold him back from what he feels is his deeper purpose. You see him try to exercise this all the way through the show by trying to be a mentor to younger addicts. There are huge hurdles in front of Bubbles. It's hard for him to maintain a consistent living arrangement, he isn't attractive to any employers, and he's estranged from his family, so nobody's really willing to go the distance with him in his recovery process. He encounters lots of people who do legitimately seem to understand that he's a good person and to even want to help him. This happens early in the show with Detective Kima Griggs. She goes way above and beyond what's required of her to retain him as a confidential informant, and this seems to be because she wants what's best for him. But at the end of the day, Kima has a lot of her own concerns to balance. She isn't going to sacrifice in a major way to help Bubbles. She genuinely wants what's best for him, even if it comes at the expense of his value as a confidential informant. But Kima is powerless to provide him with the final piece of the puzzle that's missing. She can't provide him with the follow-through. Bubbles faces all of these external hurdles to getting better, his attempts at self-reliance and his repeatedly being robbed blind, and nobody's ever there to protect him. Nobody in his life has the same motive to help him that people around him have to use him. Drug dealers want his money and robbers want his goods. They both continue to benefit as long as Bubbles stays trapped where he is. The people who want to help Bubbles want to help him as like their 15th or 16th priority after fixing all of the shit that's going wrong with their lives. And can we honestly cast judgment at them? Can we honestly tell ourselves that Kima owed him more than she gave him? No, the only person who ever stood a chance of helping Bubbles is someone that gets something from it, and that could only be someone who's navigated the pain that he's currently navigating and who derives a sense of purpose and fulfillment from providing the help. Kima is powerless to help Bubbles cross the final leg of his journey, but Waylon, the recovering drug addict who sponsored Bubbles as a Narcotics Anonymous counselor, can help him. Figures like Waylon are worth their weight in gold. The pain that they've experienced in life is the motive that drives them. It's what fuels their consistency and makes them lifelong pillars of support for the people who need them. The fact that Waylon has been where Bubbles has been, and that he's made it where he wants to be, gives him legitimacy in Bubbles' mind. It means that his advice and his pure presence in Bubbles' life is enough to help him make the difficult journey of recovery. And importantly, Waylon gets something out of it. It allows him to live his life with the knowledge that the pain and suffering that he went through in the past meant something, that it wasn't a pure, meaningless tragedy. This is a motive that Waylon seems to share with Dennis Wise. Dennis's journey in the third season starts with an immense pain, the pain of knowing that he's acting in a way that betrays his inner values. When he rejoins the Barksdale organization after more than a decade in prison, the higher-level voice in his head just refuses to allow him to delude himself. He knows that by continuing to live the life of a gangster, he's making a statement to himself that cheap pleasures matter more to him than his values, and yet he's still tempted by the benefits that only gang life will bring him. Dennis ends up relaying an experience to a pastor that I can relate to very intensely, and it was the experience that caused me the greatest internal panic of my life.
It's like I'm standing outside myself, watching me do things I don't want to do, you know? Just seeing me like I'm somebody else, but never ever being able to stop the show.
I think that this pain was more debilitating to Dennis than any pleasure that he'd ever experienced was pleasant, and I think that this is ultimately the well that he draws his strength from. There is no pleasure that Dennis can conceive of that matters to him more than never feeling this pain again. This was how he found the strength to walk away from the only profession that he'd ever known and the only people who'd ever had his back, with no plan, with nothing but a firm commitment to himself to make the suffering that he'd endured matter. The road to fulfilling his vision is fraught with hardship, but once he's created it, it exists. It's his. There's nobody standing over him to tell him what to do. Once he's created his gym, he has no real competition because, like Waylon, he's able to derive a reward from a pursuit that nobody else even perceives or seeks, a reward that's uniquely valuable to him. I think that the closest that The Wire gets to outright telling you what the point of the show was comes in a scene with Waylon and Bubbles. After Bubbles succeeds in making it a year clean, he and Waylon meet in a park to catch up and chat. Bubbles shares that he's just been featured in a story in the Baltimore Sun, chronicling his struggles with addiction and his attempt at making a new life. After discussing the story with him, Waylon passes him a written quote that he keeps on himself. Presumably it's one that's given him comfort through his own quest to stay clean.
You can hold back from the suffering of the world. You have free permission to do so, and it is in accordance with your nature. But perhaps this very holding back is the one suffering you could have avoided. Franz Kafka.
Bubbles' story is ultimately characterized by his decision to stop trying to avoid the lower pains that drugs helped him to avoid. Bubbles chose to stop seeking immediate relief from the pain of withdrawals and the pain of all the traumas he'd endured because Waylon helped him to realize that nothing would ever take those pains away. He helped him realize that in focusing on those pains exclusively, Bubbles was wasting an opportunity to address his real pain, the pain of knowing that he has something of value to give the world. The thing about fighting the lower level pains is that in the long run, it's an act of futility. In the short term, we're very good at telling ourselves that we can satisfy our base needs and our higher needs with no conflict, or we can even go a step further and convince ourselves that they're the same need. But over time, the contradictions build up. The short-term relief that we get from the lower pains always fades, leaving this buildup of the higher level pain to the point that you can have one of the scariest experiences a human being can have. The sense that some part of you has just taken a step back and is watching you, wondering how everything got to this point. When we choose expediency and compromise, not out of rational calculation, but out of desire for money and status, we're good at hiding this from ourselves in the short term. But in the long run, we end up where Burrell ends up, wondering what all of that compromise, maneuvering, and backstabbing was actually for. Facing the end of it all with no more ladder steps to climb, Burrell has this moment of clarity. He knows that the end result of all the games that he played is going to be a plaque on the wall with his name and a pension. Pension checks that every time he cashes them, he knows that they come from a career that represented a wasted opportunity. He gets to live the rest of his days knowing that he could have made a difference and that all that it would have cost him was a completely fake, fleeting sense of status that nobody else ever gave a shit about.
Plaques for hacks.
prerogative of any big city mayor.
A life lived for the sake of achieving some reputation is ultimately a waste. Omar, for the fierce reputation that he achieved in the streets, eventually fades to nothing after his death. The detectives who he had encountered over the course of the series barely seem to register the news of his death, and the only reason that the coroner catches that his name was swapped at the morgue is that it was swapped with a 50-year-old white man. What then was the point of Omar's life? It could only be that he didn't waste his life trying to eliminate pains that infinitely regenerate. Omar rejected what was expedient. He decided to live life for the sake of fulfillment, to adhere to his own code no matter what, and most importantly, he decided to be his own judge. What we as the audience find so compelling about Omar is that he's completely unique among the characters in the show in one specific way. His life is marked by a total absence of the higher pain. He feels lower level pains, physical pain and the pain of loss, but none of us manage to avoid those pains. Omar managed the only pain that he had the power to manage. He lived without compromise and he paid the price for it, and he therefore never for a moment had to live with self-doubt. When he's first released from prison after 14 years, Dennis feels three pains: the pain of having been deprived of sensory indulgences, the lack of a sense of status and importance, and a deeper pain stemming from his realization of how atomized, isolated, and ruthless life on the street has become. A pain that's characterized by a guilt of knowing that he has the power to do something about it. Dennis makes the same fundamental realization that Bubbles makes. He confronts the fact head-on that he can only address one of these pains, that preserving his status with the gang can only come at the cost of sacrificing his higher values. To me, the quote of the series isn't any of its most iconic ones. "Come at the king, you best not miss. No lake, no trout. All the pieces matter." No, to me the quote of the series is Dennis recognizing that his higher and lower voices are in conflict and making a choice.
But you ain't done shit else. You know what I'm saying? So what you gonna do?
I don't know. But it can't be this.
Like Bubbles, once Dennis makes this choice, everything else becomes a math problem. He can solve his short-term money problems by working in landscaping. The pain that he feels in his lower back is nothing compared to the pain of rejecting his values. It's only someone with this unshakable resolve who can maintain a positive disposition through the process of building the necessary funds and navigating the nightmare clusterfuck of licensure and city code compliance. Nobody but Dennis is willing to go through with a plan like this. It's laborious, time-consuming, and has no obvious material payoff looming in the future as a reward. But to Dennis, it's a no-brainer because he's competing for a resource outside of traditional resource pools. For him, this is helping to alleviate the higher pain, the great pain of his life that trumps all of the others. Dennis is just one of many characters in the show who you see at one point yearn for some bygone era. For him, it's the gang dynamics of his youth, the time when there was a sense of community and a code of honor in the streets. To the longshoremen, it's the time of their grandparents, when the profession provided them with all of their needs and seemed to have a realistic future for their children and their children's children. And for Major Colvin, it was the time before the war on drugs brought a stats obsession to policing, a time before quality of policing was synonymous with volume of arrests. Colvin spent a 30-year career climbing the ranks of the Baltimore Police Department, hoping that one day he'd hit a rank that would let him press a button that would return policing to the golden era, when a patrolman knew everyone on their beat. At the end of all of that, he's wondering where those 30 years went and why the button never appeared in front of him. More than that, he's considering whether on some level he knew the whole time that the button was never coming. But like Dennis, Colvin realizes that he has a choice. He can either ride out the next 6 months and coast off on a major's pension, questioning for the rest of his life why he stayed in the police force. Or he can look at his model of paradise and realize that while he can't conjure it into existence, he can do his job in accordance with those values. He can dedicate the last 6 months of his career to showing the younger cops in his district that there is another way that policing can be done. The most important thing about Colvin's decision isn't that it genuinely inspired Carver, that's a side benefit. The important thing to Colvin is that he no longer has to live with the doubt of wondering if he ever really held his values. He paid a price for those values, and he no longer has to live with the question. Where The Wire's deeper optimistic messages shine through its surface-level cynicism are cases where some of its characters realize that the higher pain is the only manageable pain. It shows cases where people who've milked the system and gone along to get along have these moments of clarity. They realize that doing the easy thing has only given them cheap, fleeting satisfaction that left them with an inner judge that just sat there watching them. Hurc may, through lack of regard for his inner conflict, rise higher in terms of material wealth and status than Carver. But if we're honest, which of us really think that Hurc got the better deal out of the two of them? There's an unbelievable psychic relief in knowing, because you paid a price for your values, that you aren't bullshitting yourself when you say that you hold them. Of all the details that I missed in my first viewings of The Wire, the one that stands out to me the most now is the change in Colvin's resting expression from the time that you first meet him to the ending of the 3rd season. One of these men is looking at a fat pension and a cushy retirement job with Johns Hopkins. All he has to do to get there is cross some T's and dot some I's. The other one has ended a 30-year career in a public scandal. He's had his pension reduced and he has no obvious next step in front of him. And yet, look at him. Our faces are great windows into our internal existence. Which of these two men would you rather be? Do you think that this Colvin regrets the decision that he made? Do you think he misses being this version of himself? Maybe he didn't realize it over the day-to-day course of his life, but the higher pain was the deepest pain of his life, the pain of doubting himself, of questioning his own motives. When I left the career that had made me so miserable, it took me months to realize how much better I felt. After the panic of the loss of my identity and the fear of a moderate degree of income loss subsided, I realized that I was still standing, and that the biggest change in my life was this unbelievable feeling of relief. And I just looked back at all those years that I suffered in total bewilderment. Just like a fish doesn't see water, I didn't see how much of a burden I had been carrying. I now just work some job. It pays worse and has worse benefits, and it doesn't use my degree, but I get by with no issue. In fact, I was able to render the drop in income mostly irrelevant with some basic lifestyle changes. This led me to a really important realization. It wasn't the need to compromise that had made me miserable in my job. It was knowing on some level what it was that was actually keeping me there. The problem was never with my bosses or the system or any of that. The problem was always me. The problem was that I kept seeking the instantaneous pain relief that drinking and the blame game brought, and on any given day it worked perfectly. The only problem is that over time it made another pain worse, the pain of knowing that my reliance on my job to fulfill all of my needs was what had put me in this situation. Of knowing that it's far more likely that the corruption in the system was the result of my bosses and their bosses making the same mistake that I had made, that we were separated by time, not some innate quality. The need for instant short-term pain relief kept me from doing things to address the deeper pain, and to address it I really only had two options. Either I had to restructure my life so that I was less dependent on my job to meet all of my needs, or I had to find my own path, to stop waiting for someone to throw the ring into Mount Doom and fix all of my problems, and to start living in a way that gave value to the pain that I had suffered. The reason that The Wire kept coming back into my mind during the most difficult period of my life was that it gave me a sense of certainty that I had to pick one of those two paths, that there was no third option for me. I think that this is really what makes a work of fiction optimistic, if it comforts you and gives you strength in periods of serious hardship. And while making the decision that I made was ultimately very difficult, the comfort that I gained by thinking back on the characters and themes of The Wire gave me the strength that I needed to make it. I felt in those moments like I'd been in this place before, like I knew what was ahead of me if I didn't make a change. I became convinced as I replayed it in my mind that the only path that I could not take was continuing my current course. I realized that I was the only moving piece in the complex puzzle that was my life's pain. And I came to understand at last that the only questions that mattered were why am I feeling this pain and what can be done with it.
You know, I always wanted to say how sorry I am how things turn out. There wasn't anything that I could have done with your experiment in the Western District. There wasn't anything that anyone could have done with that.
Yeah, well, I guess, Mr. Mayor, there's nothing to be done.